Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that's been on my mind lately for myself and on behalf of my clients is this concept of the personal economy and working with it with intention in order to have more stability and consistency and the outcomes we want in tumultuous economic times. So I think many of us suffer from what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically speaks to the fact that our brains will lie to us and tell us that we understand a complicated subject because we read a little bit about it or witnessed a little bit about it. And it's one of the ways that our brains by default try to stay in power saver mode, because onboarding really complicated expert skill and information takes a lot of brain power. Neuroplasticity demands a lot of calories, and we in the modern era are really, it's a very new thing for most humans most of the time to have secure access to food. So we don't have to run our brains in power saver mode, but our brains haven't quite caught up to that. So one of the ways that our brains work is to tell us, we understand economics. And I think it's worth noting that this overall thing of economics, how money is moving, is literally a co-creation of billions of people. Everyone who's in the money experience in some way is constantly making choices and pivoting, even as simple as being at the grocery store and seeing what produce looks particularly appealing and what the price point is on it, and all of the different factors and experiences. And I've seen things change in my lifetime. We look at the original, I grew up in a little tiny town, and the VHS store was a big deal because you could go and get a movie, bring it home, watch it, return it, 5 days later or whatever. And it looks that territory looks really, really different in the modern era. In fact, we're at a time where movie theaters are becoming less and less viable. And at the point of recording this, we have had a new administration take over in the United States, and I don't want to go into politics, but there's some really sharp pivots, or the illusion of really sharp pivots, and I don't know which, because my expertise was in mechanical engineering and now shamanism, and so I never, ever, ever took a college level class, even a 101 class about economics. I think it probably would have been interesting, but way more interested in other things. I have a much better layperson's knowledge of, how our brains work than I do of how our economic systems move. But when I look at the headlines, it is a conversation in the United States that is very, very vigorously being discussed, and what the outcomes will be and how this might be experienced. And it's understandable, because one of the things that is really important for people, we have a lot of correlation between safety, security, survival, and this money thing. And we tend to be a little bit dubious of change anyway, unless we're really, really sure it's going to go well for us. And there are a whole lot of unknowns. Things are being done differently very, very quickly, or at least that's the, what it feels like and seems like to a lot of Americans related to this whole economics thing. And the impact is really unknown. But one of the things, that's true of humans is we're 2.5 times more likely to think a scary, stressful thought than a life-affirming one or a hopeful one. So when we vision, there's a change, we think about how it could make things worse and how we might deal with it. We seldom are like, well, maybe this will be a wonderful thing. And so I'm not necessarily saying that you ideally need to cultivate a lot of optimism about the changes. A lot of people are very activated. There's a lot of fear and anger and sadness and glee and just some really big emotions that are running right now. And my hope is that in the cycle, by the time this is released, the waters have leveled. But regardless, I think that this notion of how much attention we pay to the overall economy, which I would argue the human brain just doesn't have the processing capability to really wrap itself around, because it's so complex, because how humans respond to things can have a whole bunch of different aspects. I remember watching a play that was really interesting, and it was really exploring the movement in America when manufacturing was moved abroad in this town that had really been based on all of these people being union factory workers, and seeing their jobs go away and seeing all the different, stress points in relationship, people who had a propensity toward addiction, seeing that get a lot worse. At one point, one of the characters says, I just don't understand when humans lost the capacity when a well goes dry to move to another place. That was something our ancestors would have done. And it was this interesting exploration without necessarily any kind of conclusion of just all of these people in this journey where the major economic experience in the town that wasn't super great to begin with. We started off with a picture of how much, those jobs were breaking down people's bodies and things like that. But there was a financial stability that really incentivized people to keep participating with them. So all of this is to say that if we can cultivate sort of a sense of, wow, there's this huge co-creation going on, and my brain actually can't meaningfully understand it. But what I can look at and what I can work with is my personal economy. And when we're tending to our personal economy, there are different aspects. So one of the aspects is, talking to your financial planner, or what percentage you might put away into a retirement account, or how you might, remodel your home or not remodel your home. There are all these really practical things about budgets and spending and, investing in the future and, so on and so forth. There's a whole lot of really practical day-to-day engagements for what we get up to, and a lot of pivots that we make if, the rug gets pulled out from under us. People, when we experience unemployment or being laid off or those kind of things. And then there's this other part, which is sort of the energetics of how money works in our personal economy. And I find that really interesting because a lot of the clients that I work with and the people who are, part of my sphere of concern, who are interested in having access to my ideas about how they might, improve their lives and have a better experience, something more aligned with what would really work for them, have had a lot of past lives where maybe they incarnated in situations where they were in a spiritual life. So if you were in a monastic life, if you were a Buddhist nun or a monk, and you took vows of poverty and you lived in this really structured order with communal living and this very simple life, you just wouldn't come in with the same soul mastery of how to live a secular life and work with money. And a lot of people are pivoting. They're like, well, I did the spiritual life. I'm still really interested in that, but I'm also really interested in experiencing, being a parent or romantic love, or how I could trade my time and talent for money in a way that has meaning for me. There's just a lot of diversity, and there's a lot more freedom and dynamic movement. These religious sects and lives were very, very narrow. They weren't democracies, that was an aspect that we don't necessarily think about. It was a take it or leave it. This is the structure that we've agreed on to be up to doing this thing. And so I think there's a lot of kind of beauty of moving in the world, but there's just a different approach where someone who is both spiritual and secular, having, the experience of being out in the world, really needs to have all 7 chakras turned on and working equally well. And certain religious traditions really emphasize bringing the focus off of certain chakras and more activating of other chakras. And while that can be great for a really specific circumstance, a lot of what I'm working with my clients, and a lot of what I would recommend, is having a commitment to having all the chakras be really, really vibrant and healthy. And the lower chakras really deal with how we interface with this system of money. And I could talk a lot about this. In fact, I did. I have a whole program in my academy that's on money mastery that goes through all these different energetic elements and aspects. So I'll put a link in the show notes. Feel free to reach out if I forget to do that. And you can have a chance to really delve into this and learn a lot. I think that there's a sort of fundamental mastery of the energetics of working with money that is darn useful to onboard, because if we're working in right relationship with money energetically, it makes us have a lot more leverage and results for our efforts in the day-to-day world. And it's definitely a both and thing. I had one client who, as near as I could tell, was, sitting home, not particularly leaving the house, trying so hard to work law of attraction enough to bring in tons of money. And that had about the results that you would expect. I really felt for her. So some people overemphasize the energetics, some people underemphasize the energetics. There's a certain balance. But one of the kind of ideas or principles or pictures that I think is really useful to work with is this notion of your personal economy. And I think of my personal economy when I visualize it a little bit like I think about my personal energy body field. So one of the parts of my energy body I pay a lot of attention to is the outer edge, sort of the skin of my energy body. And it's this, bubble and container, and the place where I put a barrier where I'm not welcoming other people's energy into my own personal system. So many of us, myself included, have had a lot of challenges of energetic permeability, which means other people's energy and experiences and ideas about who we should be and things like that could get pushed into our energy field, and then it's an intrusion into the system. In fact, one of the principles of what causes illness in shamanism is energetic intrusion. So extraction is a really big deal in shamanic medicine for treating illness and all kinds of discomfort and unhappiness. And this notion of moving through the world with this pure, clean, true to you kind of energy is, I think, really valuable. And I use the analogy of our skin. Our skin is very sophisticated. It lets in oxygen. It transmits sensation through the skin. We can feel if something is wet or dry. There's all this ability to sense the world around us, but it does a good job of keeping the blood on the inside and bacteria out. And once the skin is broken, things can get a lot more complicated, especially for earlier humans who didn't have quite so much access to clean running water and antibiotics. But in the modern era, even so, things are more complicated and uncomfortable if the skin isn't intact and doing its job. And I would argue similarly, when our energy body is really intact, it has really good filters, there's a lot of things that follow very well. And one of my intentions for my energy body is to have it be able to be adjacent to vibrations and energies that are very different from my own and still really hold the integrity. And I use tools for this. So, when I'm out in the world and going to the grocery store, I'm probably wearing a Herkimer diamond just because it helps amplify and strengthen and work on behalf of that intention, even when my conscious attention comes off of that. But it's sort of like the old Peanuts cartoon where one of the characters was walking around with a rain cloud over his head. Everywhere he went, a personal rain cloud moving with him. Everybody else has sunny weather. And I think similarly, we're kind of doing the opposite, that if the economy of the world, if this co-creation is in a lot of take apart and movement and kind of like an earthquake shaking up the land, and suddenly the water's coming up here or the stream's flowing in a different direction, there's a real tumultuous and activating aspect to that. We want to have our personal economy look a little bit like a gyroscope on a ship. And I think I'm using the right word, but it's this thing for navigation where the ship can tilt and go in all these different directions, but it's positioned such that it always stays, which direction is down, which direction is up. It's oriented and it's impervious to all this movement. So it can be in a situation with all kinds of dynamic movement and shifting and changing and tumultuousness as a ship is kind of tossed on the sea, but it's holding its orientation very, very solidly. And I think this is a good analogy on a lot of different levels, but for our personal economy, there's this notion that we have this little economic world that really is most ours to tend. And this isn't to say that charity isn't a lovely thing, and supporting people who are struggling, or donating to animal shelters, or contributing to environmental groups. It feels really good to me to work on offsetting my carbon footprint by donating to the Amazon. There's something that really touches my heart about the Amazon, even though I've never traveled there. I just really, really, really want the Amazon to do well. And so it's lovely to be able to, move our economic influence out in other ways. But at the core of it, we really want this very stable, aligned, supportive personal economy that is very reliably available to work as a foundation. And if it comes out of that, we want to put attention on tending to that. Sometimes it takes a minute. I have a friend who just got laid off, and she's just in the process of a job search. She's being very diligent. She doesn't love it, but she has financial reserves, and it takes a little while. It can sometimes people jump into another job very, very quickly, but sometimes it's a process of a lot of persistence. So it's not to say that if your personal economy is a little bit disrupted, if it's robust, it's just that you might end up needing to really put your attention on it, getting it to that stability, and then holding that intention and focus to sustain this bubble so that you have, you could visualize it as like a peaceful, sunshiny day with a nice breeze on the inside of this bubble that is your personal sphere of concern with money, even though there could be, stormy weather going on outside, a lot of movement, a lot of fear, a lot of activation. And some people, really like to visualize. Some people, it's a way that you feel in your body, but this kind of intent and focus on creating a personal economy and taking a little bit of your attention off of the national or international economies, I think is really useful because, we are designed to want to look outside of ourselves and sort of understand the influences. But as hunter-gatherer people or sustenance farmers, that was a very local looking around. It really wasn't this abstract knowing what was going on for people on the other side of the planet and new laws that were being passed. We didn't have this kind of infrastructure that affected people in the same way. And sometimes you did, there's some grim times in feudalism where somebody made really bad, irresponsible choices, decided to, go to war on some ridiculous pretext and co-opted all the people who were needed to grow food and marched off. And, there were definitely dark ages, hard times, not making light of that. But for a lot of humans, we've been really, really fixed in paying attention to much more local sort of influences. And now there's just a lot of kind of people who have no background in economics, no training, who really feel like their idea of how things are going to go is true and accurate because our brains lie to us about this. It's just the nature of the biology that we have. It's kind of wacky. So in terms of sort of moving through this time or any time, I think it's really useful to calm the fight or flight and to self-soothe and kind of look at how much infrastructure there really is. There are times when I look around at, people who are making choices that look really different. You can see people who are homeless and yet somehow they're finding a place to sleep and food to eat every day and water to drink. And, they're still traveling through an experience, and it's not something I would love to experience. I'd love for us collectively to figure out a way to, work with that a little better. It's not my passion or the thrust of what I'm focused on, dealing with that population. It's more of my general humanitarian. May we all be well. And yet there are just so many ways that people go through really hard things that seem like they might be a problem, and yet they figure out a way through. The resourcefulness, especially on the fundamental survival level, is really quite extraordinary, especially for people who have the infrastructure of developed nations and often, even in developing countries, lots and lots of resourcefulness. So The thing is, it can really turn into an energy leak if you're sort of in this collective activation of the swirling unknown, because I think some part of us, even if our brain is saying, oh, it's going to be this, and okay, how am I prepared? There's another part that says, I really don't know what's going to happen. This is really kind of uncharted territory. And I think that uncertainty is part of the nature of being human. And so self-soothing, getting really good at self-soothing and consciously thinking about unplugging from the collective. So again, coming back to this notion that when you think about money, a lot of people's minds might be really stormy, really fearful, really angry, really sad, and they might have some really concrete reasons for their lived experience of what's happening in a contemporary moment, or it might just be abstract kind of things where, they're frightening themselves with their thinking, because humans have a good knack for that. But regardless, coming back to this notion that you're creating this protected bubble of energy that shelters your personal economy, and it's like a garden that you're tending and allowing to thrive. And so humans can grow the most extraordinary orchids in greenhouses, but greenhouses, take some effort. They take some tending, and yet we have this capacity to create this huge contrast where in a place with weather that many, many plants would never survive, you can, make this special space. Some of the Victorian conversations are about the oranges that were being cultivated in England and the sort of status of that, because you were carefully creating an environment that allowed these things to grow and thrive when they wouldn't under normal circumstances. And so, sort of recognizing that with your care and tending and having this space that you are present with and attentive to, you have the ability to create this personal economy that can thrive through a lot of ups and downs and perceived whatever. And certainly, you may be one of the people that needs to pivot. Like if you were Blockbuster, you at some point needed to find another place to be employed. There was this, shift away from it. So it's not to say that, if you do this work, you can just keep everything the same. Part of that gyroscope nature is this notion of allowing and cultivating lines of flow based on what the landscape is and what's most easeful and elegant about getting the money that you need to get in a way that's aligned with your integrity and, isn't a deal breaker for any of your other chakras. So it doesn't make you miserable. You don't have to put up with toxic people. It isn't ethically, questionable. It doesn't have really incredible high levels of danger for your survival. There are lots of, attentiveness to what's most effective, but it's sort of like a population that was getting their water from a well, and then an earthquake comes and suddenly the well is dry. There might be some howling and gnashing of teeth at that well, but then everybody's looking around for, where did the water go? Because the water is still there. It's going to bubble up. So adjusting where they go for it, even adjusting where they live to be adjacent to water is something that would happen. So you're still keeping the idea of this personal economy that's robust doesn't mean that it's not adaptable, doesn't mean it doesn't change the places and the ways and the avenues that money flows to it. It's just that you're sustaining and tending this bubble of energy. And it does take energy. Again, like a greenhouse can be really beautiful, but there's energy that goes into it. If a pane of glass gets smashed, it needs to get blocked off or repaired. Different times of the year have different experiences. There's an attentiveness, and I feel like there's just a lot of influence in the world that can make us feel vulnerable to just being overrun by circumstances beyond our control. And, sometimes that does happen. And the more robust our personal economy and the more that we've created a vibrational space where we're relating to economic health and well-being, the more resistant that is to changing. So it's not to say that you would want to try to just move energy in order to create an outcome. We want to take right action as well. However, certain people who have really healthy chakras, who have a good attentiveness, who relate well with money, even if they go through a financial take apart, they tend to kind of come back into a recovery period. There tends to be a return to the baseline, something that moves and pivots. And it's sort of interesting to look at some of the studies, like people tending to make a really similar amount to the people they hang out with the most. And sometimes people make it sound like, oh, cultivate wealthier friends, which I don't recommend. I think you should have the friends that really work for you. But sort of this awareness of how, in order to kind of create this energy of economic stability, it's good to be willing to just invest some of your time and attention and focus on hanging well with money, on having a capable layperson's understanding of money, to being attentive to money, to being present with money. One financial advisor I know who does both the woo-woo and the practical really well, talks about having a date with money, like you would with a sweetie pie. If you had somebody that you really cared about, you're like, okay, we're busy all week, but let's have this time where we go and connect in our relationship. And similarly, having this regular dates with money where you look at it and see how it's flowing, and you're up to date on all the information, and this kind of good feeling of like, thank you for hanging with me. And then there's a freedom where ideally it doesn't have to be top of mind, because if you're being inattentive to money, if your personal economy is really wobbly and you're trying to tune it out or procrastinate on looking at it, there's a underlying anxiety and tension. Anytime we have something that's really important that we're not tending to, and this could be, we really need to go to the dentist, or we really need to get our taxes done, and we know it's going to be worse the longer we wait to address this really important thing, but we're resisting. We haven't quite figured out how to wrangle ourselves to face the thing that we're avoiding, that we're afraid of. It's a very, very normal human thing. And unfortunately, sometimes shame builds up about that. So then we're even more to get through to the attentiveness to the details of life. So this business of being human can be really complicated, but there are these energy leaks when we're not being present. So I think that there's just, for the deeply spiritual person, deeply energetically connected person, someone who cares profoundly about the good of humanity, there are really good reasons to be attentive to money, even if it's not a flavor you particularly enjoy, so that it provides you with a really good foundation and just takes ultimately a lot less of your time and energy. Because I know people who are just constantly in the tap dancing and the resourcefulness of dealing with, one crisis after another, and they can be magnificent at the hand to mouth and the strategies, and okay, this will clear, and then this, and I have this much time before, my electricity gets turned off. But there's just so much of their energy that is caught up in that. And sometimes, that's part of the rite of passage of, figuring out how to manage money as we grow up, or things like that. So none of this is to, criticize anyone for where they are on the path. It's just a lot of what I'm really interested in is supporting people in coming into this greater experience of ease and elegance and availability to write our own tickets, by which I mean live the life that we really want to live something that really works for us. And I feel like right relationship to money is a really important part of this. And of course, I have, lots and lots to say on the details and the adjustments, but I would just really invite you to start kind of tending the energy of your personal economy, because you may be familiar with space clearing and tending the energy of your home. You may have done some feng shui. You may be really attentive to the energetic hygiene of tending your energy body. You may be attentive to the hygiene of your physical body, both in terms of washing, but also, enough clean eating to, have your liver be as happy as possible, or, at least happy enough. I'm a big fan of enough. And similarly, thinking of this as having a defined energetic sphere that represents your personal economy, and protecting and filtering the outside chaos and organizing and clarifying the energy within can be a really effective way to kind of wrap your head around what you might be up to in terms of just energetically setting up your personal economy to be really solid and robust and working on your behalf, for the freedom it gives you to move through the world when you get this aligned. So I hope there's something here that sparks for you or that is helpful. It's just a concept that I've been working a lot with my individual clients and the people who are in my group money offers to just really help the solidity and robustness and gyroscope nature of personal economy so it can stay really stable and healthy and aligned and functional, even in a time with a lot of economic uncertainty and take apart. And I know that, being in the United States, it's more acute. Probably if you're listening from Australia, I don't know what your details are, but you might be like, it's pretty much business as usual. But I think at some point there's always something that moves or changes or is in take apart that we don't know what the larger picture will be. And if we come home to our own sphere of concern, and then, for sure you can help with whatever's left over. I love being part of the Buy Nothing group in my neighborhood and offering up things that aren't useful and having them go to people who can get use from them. And they're ways that we can help and tend each other. But this is sort of a get solid yourself first and come from a place of abundance so you can share and participate with what's left over, rather than, just there's an inelegance to giving someone the shirt off your back, so to speak. And so I'm a really big fan of making our personal economies really abundant for the freedom it then creates to move around the world without having to constantly be using so much of our attention to be so attentive to this part of life. The more that we can, have it working like a well-oiled machine and have it flowing and supporting us and using a steady amount of our magic and intention instead of emergency magic and attention, I think is really, really worthwhile and something that I've shifted in the course of my life and has paid some really good dividends in terms of my overall life experience. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.